Hi, I'm Laura Swift. I'm a classics tutor at Magdalen College in the University of Oxford. This is my colleague, Moreno, who teaches ancient history here as well. We're going to do a demonstration interview with Lily in a minute, who is applying for a degree in classics. And we're going to talk a bit first about what we're looking for in a classics interview and what form it normally takes. So classics is an interdisciplinary degree, and that means there are quite a range of possible skills that a classicist might have. It's a degree that involves aptitude for languages, analysing literature, being a historian, handling material culture, and also some philosophy. Not all of those are going to be tested in every interview, but probably a range of them will be across the interviews that you have. We know that it's a subject that people have different levels of exposure to from school. Some people may have done classical civilization or Latin or Greek at school, and others won't. We're absolutely not expecting certain types of knowledge or facts. We're not interested in how much you know or have memorized about the ancient world. And we're very happy for people to apply who are just really passionate about classics, whether or not they've studied it formally in the school curriculum. What we're trying to do is assess your aptitude for the skills that a good classicist needs. And so not what you know, but what you do with the knowledge that you do have, and how you react to a piece of information that we might give you that you might not have come across before. And there aren't right or wrong answers to the questions. We want you to think of it as a discussion. If there's anything you need clarified, if there's anything that you don't understand, then we want you to ask so that we can explain it to you just like you would in any normal discussion. In terms of the structure, then you'd usually get 2 interviews at your first preference college, and there would always be at least 2 tutors present in the interview. The interviews might be quite varied in form, so we can't really say exactly what will happen to you as an applicant. You might be sent something to read in advance to talk about in the interview. You might be shown something on screen during the interview. You might be asked questions about your personal statement, what you've said that you have read or enjoyed about the classical world at school. You might be asked questions based on your written work. And so there's quite a wide range of options for what a classics interview could look like. And what we're going to do today is just one possible. It's not the only way that a classics interview can be run.
The interview more or less proceeds as a mini tutorial would. And that's another of the things that we look for in an interview is how teachable the candidate might be in a tutorial format. I will be asking some things about ancient history, showing the candidate some images and text on the screen. And just as Laura said, we're not expecting pre-existing knowledge of any kind. And we encourage all candidates, if they ever feel lost or don't understand what it is that we want, to ask for clarification or for more information if they need it.
Welcome, Lily. Lily is actually a current student, so she obviously has already been through this process, and she's now studying here, so she may have a bit more knowledge than somebody who is still in the final year of school, but she's very kindly agreed to help us out. So, Lily, I'm going to talk to you for the first part of the interview, and then a little bit later, I'm going to pass you over to Al, who is going to ask you some more history-focused questions. If there's any problem with the technology, or if you need to ask us to repeat anything, please don't feel worried about that. Just let us know, and we will make sure things get back on track.
Okay.
So I saw on your personal statement that you said that you have been reading the Odyssey at the moment. And yes. So I wondered if you'd feel willing to talk a little bit about that text now.
Yes.
So I guess the first question I wanted to ask was, I think in children's book versions of the Odyssey, then the narrative proceeds chronologically. Odysseus leaves Troy, he has all his adventures, then he gets back home. In the original poem, then Odysseus tells all the adventures of the exciting things he's done and the encounters he's had with monsters in a flashback in the first person. Why do you think the poet does it that way?
I think it kind of helps us to really conjure up a reality, and like we get to know how Odysseus himself felt during the things he experienced, and we also get a lot of like different comments on the things he sees. For example, like the comments on how he perceives the Cyclops to be, or also how he thinks how for example, Laestrygonians, he like describes them a lot, and on this side we get a lot of like emotions, like we get a lot of emotions that Odysseus himself felt during his adventures. On the other side, I think it also kind of emphasizes the intelligence and unreliability of Odysseus, because we often get told that he is like an Odysseus of many wiles. So he is cunning, he's clever, and so it might also show us how he's trying to manipulate his internal audience, which are the Phaeacians, by like framing his narrative. So it then emphasizes that he has an agenda at the point when he's telling his stories, and so we like see another one of Odysseus' stories, like one of his lying stories, which he also tells later on in Ithaca. And that might also emphasize his intelligence and his metis, which, yeah, is demonstrated throughout the poem.
So you said a minute ago Odysseus has an agenda. What do you think his agenda is?
So we know that, or we don't know, but like we get to know in the poem that he has been suffering all of those years for, and has been traveling along and trying to get home. And he's now the court of the Phaeacians, and before he is told by the princess Nausicaa and also by Athena that he needs to persuade the Phaeacians, especially Arete, the queen of Phaeacia, to escort him home. So, for example, like by telling these stories, he kind of tries to persuade the king and the queen to help him home. And there he tries to evoke pity on the one hand. For example, when he talks about how he loses all his men during his travels, and there emphasizes his grief about all the different events that he is facing, or like he was facing. And at this other time, he also shows himself as very clever, very intelligent, and also worthy of being helped. For example, with the Cyclops episode, there he repeatedly emphasizes his cunning with the no-man trick, and so he like by using both of these aspects, like by invoking pity and always also like showing off his intelligence, he might just try to persuade the Phaeacians to help him home.
And you mentioned the Cyclops episode. I mean, he makes a pretty bad mistake, doesn't he? Because he takes his men into this cave where they get trapped, and then a bunch of them get eaten. Might the Phaeacians not think, you know, this guy's a bit of a fool? He's a terrible leader. Why should we help him?
I think he explains, or like in the narrative itself, he explains it with his hope of receiving guest presents. So I think you could explain his like naivety to expect presents with like the common practice of hospitality in ancient Greece. So maybe the Phaeacians would kind of understand that. However, at the same time, you could also argue that they know of this, like, because they were the Cyclops' former neighbors, so they maybe would also not understand it. But I think it could also show like his desperate, like his despair in the situation. So maybe they understand that he's just like so desperate to like get gifts, or like to have someone to help him. Even hear the Cyclops, because Odysseus doesn't know beforehand what the Cyclops is, or who he is, or if he's good or evil. The Phaeacians might know that, but Odysseus at that point does not. So it shows us this pair that he is willing to like appeal to anyone to have him help get home. So maybe that also like helps with evoking pity.
And I mean, you mentioned that he's quite devious. Do you think that means we can trust this narrative? Can we just take it as true that these things happened in the way that he says?
I don't think we can say that it is true exactly in the way he tells it. I mean, at some like what does some aspects of his tale are repeated in other of his lying tales. So maybe like the basic structure might be correct, but obviously because he's so devious and so clever, he might just like edit certain details or like leave some things out or add some other things to like just appeal to 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 fit in with his audience. So for example, with Eumaeus the swineherd later, he also tells a similar story that he was sold into slavery, like Eumaeus himself also was. So he also tries to like evoke pity with Eumaeus because he knows, okay, he suffered the same thing, and maybe he also did the same here with the Phaeacians. Obviously, we cannot know because we don't have we don't know from the narrator itself the true story. But I feel because many of details of his tale repeat in other of his tales, so maybe like the basic structure should be correct, but he obviously edits it like according to which audience he has.
So that makes us feel about him as a character. I mean, he tells lies to get on the right side of whoever he's talking to, and he, tricks this poor old swineherd who's just trying to do the right thing.
I think it depends on I think we need to differentiate between between us as a modern audience and like the ancient Greek audience, because obviously in our society lying is framed as more is considered bad and evil and wicked. However, what we've learned in school is that people have different attitude towards lying in the past. So I think it's also emphasized by Alcinous himself, who, or not Alcinous, it was Eumaeus who, even though I think he says that he does not really trust his story completely, but he thinks it's like very entertaining. So I think that might show us that in ancient Greece, maybe the fact of entertainment is sometimes more important than than like stating the correct truth, like the complete truth, as long as like the basic structure might be correct. It's a kind of ironic that Eumaeus does not really believe, especially does not really believe the fact that Odysseus is coming home. But he like accepts every other lie that Odysseus tells at that point, which is a bit ironic because the only true part of his the complete truth that he tells is Odysseus is coming home because he is coming home. So that is a bit ironic. But I think that in ancient Greece, the attitude towards lying was a bit different. So maybe that's why the ancient Greek audience might just see that as as an evidence for his cunning and for his metis, while we might see that a bit more see that in a more problematic light than the people in the past did.
And that's really interesting. And the passage you just mentioned, when Eumaeus gets quite cross with Odysseus for saying that Odysseus is coming home, does that suggest that that particular lie is somehow morally wrong in a way that the stories about where he comes from, he doesn't really believe them, but they're okay?
I think it just shows that lying about very important stuff might not be accepted. So, for example, for Eumaeus, it would be very a life-changing event if it would really come home, because it would change the whole situation with the suitors and with just the chaos which is happening in Ithaca right now. So if the stranger told a lie about that, that may also affect Eumaeus more and would get his hopes up, and then obviously it would be it would be very awful for him if this lie turned out to be a lie. And also I think there were Eumaeus also mentions that there were other people who tried to convince him of Odysseus return. So I think with the importance of it doesn't really matter to Eumaeus if Odysseus is sold in slavery, or if he just had a bad journey. It doesn't really matter to Eumaeus himself, but because Odysseus' return doesn't matter to himself because it's like would be a life-changing event for him. He may be like reacting more, would react definitely a lot more like emotionally on that to that.
Yeah. This final question is there any way you think, if it's true that the ancients didn't care as much about lying as we do, is there any way we can explain that in terms of ancient worldview or ancient attitudes?
I think it is related to like the fact that in ancient Greece the world was just like viewed as hostile in general. So I think everybody except the like own household and this one's family and his friends is just like viewed as like a competitor in like life in general and survival. And so maybe lying was then considered just like, as a way to like get through to survive, especially like as a traveler. If you want to get home and you are like in a foreign country and you just need to have somebody who helps you, then lying is just like more of a like a means to achieve one's goals rather than just like having an evil intention.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that's my section finished. So I'm going to pass you over to Al now for a slight change of tack.
Hi, Lily.
Hi.
As I said, anytime you feel that you need more information from me, do please just ask. I'm going to share my screen and start you off with a short text. Just take your time reading it through, and when you're ready to start discussing it, just let me know, okay? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just go ahead and start reading and let me know when you're done.
Okay, I'm done reading.
Okay. Just tell me your thoughts on this passage. What's going on? What is it? What's its purpose? Whatever comes to your mind.
So, like we have as mentioned in like in the sub like in like the explanation below, it's like an description from a sanctuary. So I think the I just denotes the sanctuary. So the sanctuary in itself is like talking in this inscription. So and it's dedicated to Apollo. Because we like know Phoebus, son of Leto. Then we also get to know who the person was who dedicated it. It was Alcmaeonides, so Alcmaeon's son, and he he probably is like a rich aristocratic because he like has someone Cnopiades to drive his horses in the festival. So like in the races in the festival. So he did not do that himself. So but his probably his servant or like just servant probably did that, his charioteer. And like the context was like a festival in Athens for Pallas Athena. So yeah.
Okay, great.
Very
Lots of
broadly.
good thoughts there. Can I press you on the first thing you said? You said the sanctuary is the speaker, is the I, the first word on the first line.
Yeah.
What makes you think that?
Mm, because later it's also stated that Alcmaeonides dedicated this first person. So maybe not the sanctuary itself, but maybe like an object in the sanctuary, like rather than the sanctuary itself. So maybe like
Yeah,
maybe like his chariot or something which he used in the race.
yeah, yeah. So the dedication is speaking. You're right. It's this is what's happening, and is there any way of knowing what the object that is dedicated might have been?
Mm, well, it is a delight for Apollo, so maybe an object associated with Apollo, maybe like I don't know if that is, I don't know whether the object also needs to be like in relation to the context of the dedication. So like I don't know if you understand, but so I'm not sure whether the object itself needs to be like associated with the with the reason for this dedication, but like it could, for example, like it needs to be something that is allied to Apollo. So I would think of like either the lyre or like a bow or something, but I'm really not sure, to be honest. It's like not
Yeah.
really, it's not it we don't know because we just have the I and the me, so we don't really know what the object could be. Um,
Mhm. Um, as you pointed out, this is an inscription, presumably an inscription on a block of stone that survived in the sanctuary.
mhm.
Might we learn from the stone what the object that was dedicated might have been? From the physical object, the stone containing the inscription, what else might that physical object tell us?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm not sure. Um,
Let me guide you a bit more then. Um,
thank you.
the inscription could be inscribed on the base of a monument or the pedestal, um, and so we might have the stone, the place where the object dedicated was actually placed.
Mm-hmm.
Would that help us guess what the object could have been?
Um, Let me just think for a moment, please. Um, I don't know, maybe it's like the chariot itself, like propped up on the stone itself, like as a kind of pedestal. But
Yeah, could
really,
be. Yeah. Um, well, one thing we might be interested in knowing is how big this stone is, because if, as you say, we have a kind of mini. Well, we have. Were you thinking the actual chariot could have been dedicated?
yes, it could theoretically be. I'm not sure really.
Yeah. Well, for
Uh,
that, then we would want quite a big stone.
yes, yeah. Then the size of the stone obviously matters because if it's a small stone, it could be like a small object. If it's a big stone, then it could be something bigger. Yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah, great. And sometimes the stone will have um, holes where the object was clamped or where the object stood. So quite often we might see literally the the footprints of a statue, for example, if the object was a statue.
Mm-hmm.
Might nearby dedications from this sanctuary help us guess what might have been dedicated here?
Okay.
So if we looked at other dedications made in this sanctuary, um, would, how do you think they would help us understand what is being dedicated here?
Um, Maybe we can like learn about like maybe like for different sanctuaries there's like a different group of objects that is being dedicated in the particular sanctuaries. So like maybe if we like get to know something about um what is dedicated at like another of the monuments, then maybe we can like derive from that a similar object which could be the one that is dedicated here. I'm not sure.
Excellent. Yeah, so if we happen to find a surviving dedication, and it turned out to be, as you said, a liar, then yeah, you would you I think you would be more inclined to think your initial guess was right. But if we didn't find any liars, but we found, statues, then what would you then suppose that this dedication also was a statue?
I probably would like in the sense of that, like that this is like a sanctuary for like for like that the dedications in the sanctuary itself are like similar just in general, that they're just like grouped according to type or anything.
Yeah, good. Could a statue be, as you said, a delight for Phoebus?
Um, I mean, it depends if for example, like I don't know, it's like hard to tell because then we would have to like assume like real personality to the gods themselves. So I I'm not sure to be honest. Maybe it like depends on the like craftsman of the statue. I'm not sure if, for example, if like a very famous craftsman made it, maybe then you could. But then you would like have to assume that the god really has like you would have to like impose emotions and feelings and thoughts to a god, which we cannot like theoretically because we don't know. Um, I'm a bit thrown off the question to be honest. I'm sorry.
Mhm. Let's move on to Knopiadas. You brought him up as um, as a way of characterizing the dedicator as an aristocrat. You said an aristocrat would have a driver, um, and I wonder if what's going on here is Knopiadas is a professional charioteer. Could that be um, a, a possible interpretation of his role here?
I think I think it could be that like Alcmaeonidas just like for example bet on him and then won like similar like to the chariot races in Rome where like people bet on the different teams, and here maybe also Alcmaeonidas just bet on Cnopiadas and um like used the horses of Alcmaeonidas, drove Jared with those horses, and so like thus secured the victory for him. I think that was quite common in ancient Greece that the victory wasn't still attributed to the aristocrat, even though like the charioteer like actually won.
Hmm. Yeah, so but it's his swift horses. So are we still assuming that horses belong to Alcmeonides?
I would assume that because the his if we like think in because a we need like a person to whom the his relates. So and Knopialis is only mentioned afterwards, so I'm not sure whether that is like grammatically possible if we like think about it in like in language terms kind of thing. I would assume that those are the ones of Alcmaeonidas, but I'm really not sure to be honest.
And let's move on yet again to the final line. Um, so as you said, the victory of the horses took place in a festival in Athens. Um, but as you said at the beginning, the dedication stands at a sanctuary of Apollo in Boeotia. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. So, the victory happens in a festival in a different city from the sanctuary in which the um, this offering is dedicated to Apollo.
I think that that probably just relates to the maybe like Alcmaeonidas himself is just like he's probably not an Athenian, or I think he probably is no Athenian, but like maybe came just like traveled to Athens for this festival. Um and then he probably like dedicated like made this offering rather near to his own home rather than near Athens.
let me give you a piece of background info. Alcmeonides is in fact Athenian.
Okay.
How does that change things?
Well, then maybe it's rather maybe Cnopiades himself is rather the like foreigner or like non-Athenian, probably. Maybe that is the reason for that.
Could be. So you are thinking of the sanctuary of Apollo in Boeotia being somehow related to Cnopiades' origins.
Yes, or rather, it shows like the influence of Alcmaeonides, like also in foreign or like in like foreign territories or like in other regions of Greece. So like maybe just to show off his wealth and his prestige somewhere else to like gain fame.
That's great. Yeah, I like that a lot. Can I move on quickly just to to the second thing I wanted to show you?
Mm-hmm.
Let's have a look at that and let me know when you want to start discussing it.
Okay, I'm done.
And do you see a relation between this object and the inscription we were just looking at?
So we also have a chariot race here with like charioteer right on the like middle right and the horses in the middle. So like the horses are definitely like the main point of this coin, I think, because they're like so prominent. And then we also have like another figure like over the horses that could resemble some god maybe because like the person is the person is flying, I think. So maybe that could resemble some kind of god. And we also have like at the bottom like a helmet. However, not really sure how that is related to um the inscription, but I think we like see a similar scene for this festival that was mentioned in the other inscription.
Good. That's a very good description of what you see. The flying figure is Nike.
Ah, okay. So
Yeah.
then it's definitely related in the sense that Nike is the goddess of victory. So then this relates like to the victory of Alcmaeonides in the other inscription.
Good. And does this tell you a bit more about charioteers in the Greek world?
I think it might rather maybe like they like the favor of the gods might be more attributed to them rather than them having any personal skills. I think that could maybe be because we see like with Nike being present that she like favors this charity and helps him win. So maybe it's like more about like having the favor of the gods than being the best charioteer oneself.
Mm-hmm. And you very nicely brought up the items at the bottom of the image. Do you think those have to be related to what lies above them?
Mm, I don't think so at that point. Also, I don't really see how they could be related. Maybe it was just like another, maybe I'm not sure why they maybe it's like showing like another scene already. Like maybe it's like just showing another scene. I'm at that point. Maybe it's referring to something else, maybe as well.
What makes you think that in particular?
It's just like I don't really know how to connect the helmet to the chariot race, if I'm honest. And I cannot really make out what the thing in the like bottom middle is actually. Um, I'm not really sure what
Okay.
that could be. Like maybe an armor, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it is armor. And it is armor. And then there are two things that are about the same size on either side of the armor.
Yeah, maybe, but I'm not really sure what maybe I don't know, but like probably no swords, but like because they are like too thick for swords. Um, but no, I really don't have an idea what those like. Maybe like it looks like they look like pillars, but I don't know how that could fit in. Like that doesn't make any sense.
They're shin guards or greaves.
Ah, shin guards. Okay.
Yeah, some armor for the legs. But what about the line between those bits of armor and the chariot? There's a line, a
Yeah.
big line.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, couldn't we just say the line divides the scene in half and shows us two different things that, in a way, um, two different scenes or two different views. The line, in other
Yeah.
words, is
Yeah.
is an important separator.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Well, we've run out of time. Um, but do you have any questions, Lily, or about the interview?
No, I don't, but thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lily.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, I thought one of the things that Lily did really well was the way she talked through her thinking a lot. That she didn't, if she wasn't sure of something, she didn't just go silent or panic. She talked about what she was thinking and why, and sometimes she said she needed to take a minute, which is absolutely fine. And then she made a conjecture, and I thought was quite responsive when in the latter part of the interview, when you needed to give her guidance, then she took that on board and was able to adapt what she'd said or offer a different view, and was able to make intelligent inferences that it wasn't about what she already knew about that coin or that text, but rather what she could reasonably extrapolate, and if something wasn't quite right, how she might change her thinking if she was offered asked to take a different route.
Yeah, that flexibility was very nice, I thought as well. When presented with new information, she took it on. I don't think she just accepted it. She took it on board and tried to say something new, tried to move the discussion forward using that bit of input. That was very nice. And as you said, taking some time is not a bad thing. That's something that occasionally few candidates are given bad advice by schools. We won't think you're slow if you just take a minute to think, if you really need to. I thought that she was very good on the coin in really describing what she saw, with the exception of the line, which I brought in at the end. Sometimes there are obvious things that are quite important, and it's easy to miss them in a way, even if they're really, really obvious. But when looking at something like a work of art, it's always, I think, a good idea just to um, explain what you see, show that you have a good eye, and that you are looking closely, even if there are some guesses that turn out to be wrong. That's fine. There are no points taken away for saying that a piece of armor is a sword, but there are lots of points, as it were, figurative points for just showing that you can look at something and describe it. So yeah, I thought it went well, even though both of the things I showed her were quite unfamiliar to her.
Yeah, and I thought it was a good example of how not knowing something and having to guess and perhaps making mistakes doesn't mean the interview's gone badly, but actually what we're interested in is how you handle that new information and how you respond to potentially being told you've gone down the wrong track. And I thought a moment that I thought was really impressive was when Lily said, I thought, made the very sensible suggestion that Alcmaeonides must be not an Athenian, because that would explain why he's dedicating a victory not in Athens, which was an absolutely logical thing to suggest. And that when you said, well, actually, what if I tell you he is an Athenian? Then she came up with a really great suggestion that integrated that, and she didn't get rattled or say, oh, well, I must just be wrong then. That she instead said, oh, well, if he's an Athenian, maybe this is how we could explain it, and came up with another really intelligent idea. And again, we don't care whether she knows whether he's an Athenian or not an Athenian, but it is impressive when somebody can take a starting point and then do something with it, and then be flexible if it turns out that for reasons they couldn't possibly have known, actually they were on slightly the wrong track. Yeah.
And in your set of questions, I was impressed by what she how far she took this idea that lying is just culturally relative, and gave some reasons why, you know, Odysseus might be Odysseus's lying could be explained in a context, in a very different cultural context, which she she began to detail for us. So I thought she would be a candidate that I would come away thinking had a good sense of contextualizing things historically.
Yes, and I thought she was also very well able to use the text as evidence, that she would make a point about Odysseus, but she wouldn't just let it rest on her opinion. She'd say, for example, and then she'd give a good example of a point in the text that had led her to that that statement, and that if I further pressed her on it, she was able to talk more about the reasons that she'd said that and relate them to something else that she thought about in the text, and that she came across as somebody who has read a text carefully and sensitively and is able to talk about it insightfully. And so I would infer from that she's somebody who has an aptitude for studying literature and for being able to, as you say, for being able to separate our assumptions as modern readers from how an ancient audience might have thought of a text that was produced for a different cultural context.